Charles Frederick Albright was born on August 10, 1933, in Amarillo, Texas. As an infant, he was adopted by Fred and Dell Albright, a middle-class couple living in Dallas. His adoptive mother, Dell, was a strict schoolteacher who raised Charles under an unusually rigid regime. She controlled almost every aspect of his life, including what he read, who he spent time with, and how he behaved. Dell pushed Charles to excel in school, and he proved to be intellectually gifted. He skipped 2 grades and was reading college-level textbooks while still a young teenager. However, beneath his outward academic success was the beginning of a disturbing pattern, an obsessive fascination with anatomy, particularly eyes. Charles's exposure to taxidermy came early. As a child, his mother enrolled him in a local taxidermy course, where he learned how to skin animals, preserve their bodies, and insert replacement eyes into the preserved heads. According to later psychological analyses and interviews with people who knew him, Charles developed an unusual fixation with eyes. He reportedly told classmates and later acquaintances that eyes were the window to the soul, and he collected anatomical diagrams and eye models into adulthood. Journalist Skip Hollandsworth, who later investigated the case in detail, described how Charles wished he could collect eyes the way other boys collected marbles. Despite his early signs of academic promise, Charles's behavior became increasingly erratic during adolescence. At age 13, he was arrested for aggravated assault. By 16, he had been caught breaking into stores, and police found him in possession of stolen firearms, a cash register, and burglary tools. He served a short stint in a juvenile facility. Still, thanks to his high intelligence and apparent charm, Charles was able to re-enter society with relative ease. He went on to attend North Texas University, then transferred to Arkansas State Teachers College. He claimed to be on a pre-med track, but there is no evidence he completed any medical training. In fact, he was eventually expelled for stealing laboratory equipment and forging documents. Albright developed a pattern of deception that would follow him throughout his life. After leaving college, he created forged diplomas and transcripts, presenting himself as a qualified teacher. He briefly held jobs as a high school science teacher and football coach in Dallas before being caught forging documents again. He received probation and began drifting between low-level jobs, often using false credentials. During this time, he married his college girlfriend, and they had 1 daughter. The marriage lasted until 1974 before ending in divorce. His ex-wife later described him as a manipulative liar with a disturbing interest in anatomy. The 1970s and 1980s brought further criminal activity. In one incident, Charles was arrested for stealing merchandise from a hardware store and served less than a year in jail. In 1981, he was accused of molesting a 14-year-old girl. He pleaded guilty and received a 10-year probation sentence, something prosecutors would later deeply regret. Though Charles maintained that the charge was false and that he only pleaded guilty to avoid trial, it added a new layer to his criminal profile: sexual predation. He was now a known felon with a history of fraud, violence, and sexual misconduct. By the mid-1980s, Albright had largely faded from public view. He lived quietly in South Dallas, earning money by delivering newspapers and running odd jobs. However, he had cultivated a double life. While he maintained a reputation as an eccentric but non-violent man among neighbors, he frequently visited sex workers and developed long-term relationships with several of them. According to later interviews with police officers and surviving witnesses, he used these relationships to manipulate and control vulnerable women, often paying them with small gifts or shelter in exchange for sexual favors. Some women later told investigators that he became fixated on their eyes during their encounters. In addition to his interactions with sex workers, Charles surrounded himself with disturbing literature and artifacts. When police eventually searched his home, they found numerous anatomy books, including copies of Gray's Anatomy, along with medical instruments, X-acto knives, and animal skeletons. He also kept detailed notes on forensic science and criminal procedure, suggesting a desire not just to commit crimes, but to understand how to get away with them. Throughout the 1980s, Albright's criminal behavior continued to evolve beneath the surface. His history of deception, fascination with anatomy, and disturbing obsession with eyes remained largely hidden from the public. But all of these elements were quietly converging towards something far more sinister. The first murder associated with Charles Frederick Albright occurred in October 1988, when 30-year-old Rhonda K. Bowie, a sex worker in Dallas's Oak Cliff neighborhood, was found stabbed more than 20 times. Blood pattern analysis showed a frenzied attack, yet no eye removal occurred in her case. Although not mutilated in keeping with later victims, Bowie is considered Albright's probable first victim, given the timeline and her known activities in his favorite area. More than 2 years later, on December 13, 1990, Mary Lou Pratt was discovered in Oak Cliff wearing only a t-shirt and bra. She had been shot once in the back of the head with a .44 caliber handgun, beaten severely, and both of her eyes were surgically removed, an act that marked the emergence of a chilling calling card. Investigators recognized the grave surgical precision involved in the removal, and her eyeballs were never recovered. Less than 2 months later, on February 10, 1991, Susan Beth Peterson, age 27, was found nearly naked on the same street where Pratt had been discovered. She had sustained at least 3 gunshot wounds to the top of the head, the left breast, and the back of the head, and her eyes too were removed with the same precision. Her death firmly established the presence of a serial killer, pinpointing a clear modus operandi. During this period, public fear escalated as the Dallas Police Department realized a surgeon-level skill was involved. The victims were sex workers operating in the same general locale, sharing demographic vulnerability and minimal social protection. The killer's signature, a surgical removal of eyes, prompted media labels such as Eyeball Killer or Dallas Ripper. The FBI and local authorities began circulating sketches and behavioral profiles hinting at medical training or anatomical expertise. On March 10, 1991, Shirley Williams, 45, was found dead near a curb opposite an elementary school. Unlike earlier victims, Williams was older and African American, showing an expansion in victim profile. She had facial bruising, a broken nose, and was shot in the face and top of the head. Most notably, her eyes were removed, and an embedded fragment from a broken X-Acto knife was discovered in the skin near her socket. A less precise removal than in prior cases, but consistent in intent. Throughout this killing spree, investigative teams engaged extensively with the sex worker community. This effort was spearheaded by detectives like Rookie Officer Regina Smith, who treated sex workers with respect and recognized their importance as potential witnesses. The consistent location, victim profile, and the unique surgical mutilation signaled a pattern too distinct to ignore. Police feared the damage to public confidence would worsen unless the killer was caught swiftly. Early 1991, the pattern of murders in Dallas had become unmistakable. Following the deaths of Mary Lou Pratt in December 1990 and Susan Beth Peterson in February 1991, both sex workers discovered on the same Oak Cliff street, shot execution style and with their eyeball surgically extracted with clinical precision, authorities recognized they were pursuing a serial killer whose signature involved anatomical expertise. The escalation continued in March 1991 with the murder of Shirley Williams, found nude and posed against a curb near an elementary school. Williams' eyes had also been removed, though less neatly than previous victims, and a fragment of a broken X-Acto blade was embedded near her eye socket, tying the mutilation to a handheld implement rather than surgical instruments. At this point, Dallas homicide detectives were wrestling with a chilling question. They were dealing with someone who exercised extreme care in eye removal, yet used brute force to kill. The contrast suggested both surgical familiarity and lethal intent. Detectives recognized the victims' shared vulnerability: sex workers on the margins, working in the same neighborhood, and moving in similar circles. They also began engaging with the sex worker community, deemed critical for identifying a suspect who might prey on them repeatedly. One pivotal figure emerged: Veronica Rodriguez, a sex worker who survived being attacked. She reported being raped and nearly murdered in early March by a man she escaped by fleeing to another nearby home. She said a friend, referred to as Axton Schindler, had saved her. The property she sought shelter in was later traced to Fred Albright, Charles's adoptive father. Rodriguez eventually identified Charles Albright in a photo lineup as her attacker's identity, giving police their first solid lead connecting him to the crime scenes and motive. Simultaneously, Brenda White, another sex worker, recounted a separate incident. She had sprayed her assailant with mace and escaped. She provided physical description details that coordinated with Rodriguez's account. At this juncture, rookie Dallas police officer Regina Smith took charge of the fragmented information. She compiled detailed notes and personally presented them to homicide detectives alongside Rodriguez's and White's testimony. But initially, her superiors had resisted entertaining her leads fully. Smith worked outside standard protocol. She entered Brenda White's description into the constable's database and matched it with Charles Albright's criminal record and photo, information under-recognized by homicide investigators. Later that day, homicide detectives and SWAT moved in on Albright's residence. Smith and her partner were present during the arrest. Albright remained silent as police asked if he was the killer. His cold, expressionless demeanor made a deep impression on Smith. His stare was vacant, chilling, and void of emotion. Once inside his home, law enforcement found a disturbing collection: X-Acto knives, a copy of Gray's Anatomy, and numerous true crime and forensic science books. They also recovered a .44 caliber revolver similar to that used in the murders. Most notably, fibers and hairs from inside his truck and house were reportedly consistent with samples taken from the 3 mutilated victims. Though forensic hair analysis later proved flawed, some matched a dog's hair. At the time, this formed a key part of the circumstantial case connecting Albright to the crimes. None of the murder weapons or the victim's missing eyeballs were found. The focus instead fell on Albright's obsessive fixation with eyes, his ownership of medically precise blades, and the circumstantial nexus built by witness testimony. Despite the absence of physical proof such as the eyeballs or weapon cache, the mounting body of contextual evidence persuaded investigators to arrest him on March 20, 1991. These converging elements, a survivor's identification, corroborating witness statements, forensic fibers, and his known anatomical fixation, transformed Albright from unseen suspect to arrested defendant. The investigative breakthrough hinged on connecting disparate pieces: sex workers' input, property and driver record linkage, persistent detective work by Regina Smith, and circumstantial evidence pointing directly to Charles Albright. With this, the eyeball killer's identity was finally revealed. The trial of Charles Frederick Albright began in December 1991, nearly 9 months after his arrest. Prosecutors, led by Dan Hagood, Toby Shook, and Mike Basillo, focused narrowly on the body of Shirley Williams, the only murder for which they felt the circumstantial case could carry a conviction. The charges relating to Mary Lou Pratt and Susan Peterson were initially filed but later dropped because of insufficient direct evidence. During opening arguments, the prosecution laid out a theory rooted in both witness testimony and forensic circumstantial evidence. They presented testimony indicating that Albright may have harbored resentment toward sex workers. One witness claimed that he once declared, "I hate whores. I'm going to kill all of you mother-ing whores." And another recounted that after being mocked by teammates, he responded, "Hell, I'd kill them if I could." Much of the prosecution's scientific evidence centered on hair and fiber analysis. Charlie Lynch, the forensic microscopist, testified that multiple hairs consistent with Shirley Williams' hair had been found in Albright's vacuum cleaner, and that some hairs consistent with those of Susan Peterson and Mary Pratt were discovered on blankets inside his truck. Lynch asserted that these microscopic comparisons established a consistent pattern linking Albright to all 3 victims. Ultimately, the jury found Albright guilty only for Shirley Williams' murder. Charges tied to the murders of Pratt and Peterson were dismissed mid-trial due to evidentiary ambiguity. Despite the prosecution's confidence in pattern-based linkage, the absence of direct proof, no murder weapon, no recovered eyeballs, no eyewitness identification preserved, proved decisive. On December 18, 1991, Albright was sentenced to life imprisonment in the John Montford Psychiatric Unit in Lubbock, Texas.